So this is a comment on Paul van der Klay's video. Uh, Big evangelical and its anxiety about the Jordan Peterson revival. Sky Jathani as Doug Wilson's bookend. I guess that was the title of Paul van der Klay's video. So I'm not. This video is about so many different ideas that I'm not. It's hard to me to say that it's a response to Paul van der Klay more than it is a response to some of the ideas that he brings to the fore. So I'm just going to give my partisan 2 cents, which I think Paul van der Klay. I don't think he's considered these ideas in the way that I'm going to frame them, or at least how I'm going to construct my discourse. So I think the Christian project of creating a secular part of society for politics, but specifically liberalism, the Christian project of developing a kind of secular liberalism, which is what the American experiment fundamentally reverberates as, is at the core of the problem in our current cultural epoch. And I disagree with Paul van der Klay when he says that we can't go back. I think we have to go back and we have to re-engineer secular liberalism, because in its incarnation in the American context, it is the thing that is most at fault here. I think the woke culture wars is a direct result of the failures of the secular liberalism. The idea that the secular liberalism is meant to parallel a kind of Christian moral population, I think, is a cop-out. I don't know if I can prove that, but I guess that's part of my opinion. My opinion is that the liberal project needs to be properly completed. And just because the problems in America are political problems and also legal problems. I don't know where I should start to unravel this, where I should start talking about this topic to unwind it. I mean, I've made lots of recordings that go into all these threads already, so a lot of this is going to be repetition, sadly. But basically, the American structure really does invest all power into democracy. And it does so even at the expense of the rule of law. America does not have the rule of law. The law is an ongoing experiment which gets to be democratically unfolded. So the people really are in charge. It is the rule of man, not the rule of law. Now, I'm just going to quickly get to the crux of this, where I think this relates. This is a problem for religion. This is why I think the culture in America is so religiously charged, in a sense. You really feel like you're part of the flow of history to some great extent, because the democracy is the king of America, essentially. And I do believe that there's a spiritual curse placed on a people who have a king, and that is to always imagine that the king is one of the prophets. And so that's kind of like the religious sickness that I see taking place in America. But then there's also a parallel sort of political sickness, which is that the liberalism that America has is also a kind of soft liberalism. It's not fully formed. It's not properly coherent. And that is also a product of the fact that there is no rule of law. The law is not finished and complete. And in fact, if you talk to Americans, they can't even understand what it would mean to live under a legal system and a legal theory that was complete, that wasn't being penned by the democracy. It's antithetical to the American way of thinking. It's just so alien, it can't even be fathomed. It's really quite strange. And I mean, I've gotten deep down into the dregs of that particular dynamic, and it really, it has interesting interplays with the spirit of Antichrist, I would say. But anyway, let me just put that all to one side. I would argue for liberalism to be properly formed, it needs to come to grips with its own self-limitation in some sense, that how you don't legislate morality in the law, that there's a certain limit to which the political parliamentary function of society, the plenary function, the making of law function in society needs to be yoked in a definitive bind where it can't sort of grow out of control and exponentially sort of produce paradoxes of itself and be unaccountable. The theme of accountability is really an important one here. Now, obviously, the American problem and the American solution is one and the same thing, which is that, well, the demos, the democracy just sorts it all out, and through history, it will create its own bed that it's forced to sleep in, so it's kind of all balances itself out. There's a certain symmetry in the American system. And you can kind of see that it's an engine of progress. It does real work, real cultural work in some sense, because it's then, even for the rest of the world, it can be seen as a kind of like a screen on which is projected the human condition. As this human condition is sort of tasked with manning and doing the work of governance, government for and by the people. The biggest problem here is that democracy really does have real weaknesses, and liberalism could fix those weaknesses if you had more of a hard liberalism, a liberalism that got to grips also with its own liberal intolerance paradox. Like the liberalism has weaknesses, but if you just sort of put up with those weaknesses and you perfect a system that involves liberal philosophy, then you end up with a neutered legal theory in terms of the polity of the state. Government is no longer seen as the solution to everything, because it's already been relegated as that it's not going to be able to solve every question. That it's not the cutting edge of the human experience, that's somewhere between culture and politics. It's on the cultural side of the equation. It's not on the political side of the equation. Now, perhaps I've just poorly described it, but what I've just described is often anathema to American ears. Their ears are really so itching for something that gives them, they sit on thrones as they are part of this democracy that is etching out governance and law. They get to be the makers of law, accountable to no one but their own vote, by their own sort of general consensus. So you have... Now, this would be fine if people were sort of held collectively responsible, but they're not held collectively responsible. In the batches in which that they voted, for instance. There's no justice here. Sorry, I'm really in the weeds here, so this is hard. I'm not describing this very well, but let's just say that if everyone were atomized down to the individual and had liberal rights and could protect those rights against the collective through the court, like Now, obviously, this is very dangerous because, where there's no political will and where there's lacks judicial oversight, or at least lacks judicial integrity, then my alternative falls apart. When you end up having a second-rate judiciary, or one that is been poisoned into believing that the American recipe is sort of the ultimate recipe for liberal democracy, which is, I think, impossible because, well, look at how it is prone to the culture war. I do think that America really deserves the culture war. It's being trolled by its own population to some degree, or at least a segment of its own population, because the system itself doesn't have fundamental integrity. It's all premised in the demos, in the democracy. So when you go to court, and if anyone finds against you in a court, you don't hear the judge saying to you, what you're trying to do is immoral. Instead, what they hear the judge saying is, come back when you've got more political clout, come back when you've got more control, and you're on the right side of the majority in politics. Then I'll find in your favor. I guess some people might think that that's a bit of a cartoonish reduction, but I do think that it basically stands as a faithful reproduction of the moral machinery of the American system. Obviously, all systems of government are problematic, and nothing is ever going to be beyond corruption and absolutely perfect. But in as much as that you could still have a democracy that is in control of essentially the judicial branch by impeaching people for not doing their job, as judicial officers, or changing things that shouldn't be changed, or radically misinterpreting things. Democracy can still be an integral part of keeping the system, let's say, that I propose can at least keep it on track. So there's still room for there to be a proper role to be played in democracy in maintaining the system and, in some sense, keeping it clean. But I guess the wonderful thing about my system is that, hopefully there'll be enough institutional integrity that you can sort of weather the storm. Because, what we're going through now culturally is obviously quite scary, because, there's so much authoritarianism, there's so much anti-liberal philosophy, in favor of what I interpret as being fascistic racial politics. But anyway, and I think it's very interesting that, so the woke left, as it might refer to itself as, although I see it as being a fascistic ideology, is, well at home in America, because all it has to do is win democratically. And you can see the very few safeguards there are, the very few moral objective standards that are woven into the American system. How much teeth does the judiciary actually have to bite back against woke authoritarianism? Not that much. Well, I would say it's doing a pretty poor show of it. Perhaps that's being overly critical, though. So let me get back to my main sort of point here. So liberalism in the American form is basically half-baked, is my whole point. the South African version of liberalism is much sounder and stronger, although it's been blatantly betrayed by its own judiciary, and the politics is so, racially extreme and radical that there's so many things have just been overlooked, sadly. But because South Africa should be a beacon of light in these dark times, showing how good law can rebuff, these assaults against liberal institutions and structures. But let's say for historical reasons, South Africa is in a much worse state than America is. But anyway, I used to say, maybe historically this will be very good for America, and America will sort of evolve a set of structures within its judiciary and within its institution to sort of rule out this kind of illiberal paradox where people sort of use the liberal freedom to sort of debase liberal values and promote the antithesis of liberal values, which I think institutions at least need insulation from. There needs to be in law some kind of insulation that institutions can enjoy from being assaulted by essentially the illiberal paradox. Now, what the crazy thing is that how the American structure works, because free speech is so absolute, there are actually limits on how much protection the state can. There are limits on what the state can do to resist ideology. Historically, we can even say that this is an echo of something that's already happened before. The McCarthyist Red Scare is something that, as soon as that happened, America should have done something more to upgrade its institutional framework. Because McCarthyism really sort of broke the social contract, the American social contract of democracy and liberalism, and how all this, it needed to be broken. You needed something like McCarthyism, I would say, to protect the system from being infiltrated, from the illiberal paradox, essentially. So, yeah, the problem is that America doesn't really know how to do that. You need a constitutional reconvention. And certainly now probably maybe isn't the best time to do it. Or maybe it is, but democracy is a fickle thing. I don't know where you would start. Maybe you would start on a state level, try to reform it per individual state, and then work towards some kind of federal reconvention of the Constitution. There might also be some states that have more of a natural immunity from, let's say, the woke virus than others, because they have a more entrenched sort of common law sort of tradition that has values and maxims woven into it. But sadly, the common law is really open-ended and is also developed with parliamentary sovereignty, and parliamentary supremacy is kind of woven into the DNA of common law. It's only because my country had the good fortune of inheriting the Roman law, which was law that was invented for aristocrats to essentially sue each other and, to settle the controversies between aristocrats, that then the law had to be absolutely written in stone and perfected and finished so that it couldn't be toyed with, so that you can't change the rules after you've commenced some procedure or process of motion. So, yeah, I mean, there is something in the quality of the American legal theory that I would say makes it sort of fundamentally tenuous and shaky. All of this goes into aiding the American psyche into thinking that, and I've gone into this before, but let me just repeat some of the stuff, is that the problem with the American psyche is that it doesn't know justice. Justice is a democratically manufactured concept. Justice is what the popular consensus is, the popular moral opinion is. That's what justice means in America. I mean, it really puts you at odds, I would say, with your neighbor. I think that you're in a kind of moral stasis. You're in a moral Cold War with your neighbors, and they all have different sentiments with not enough structured rights mitigating and mediating between people's differing views and interests. So, yeah, I mean, all of this is, I think, slightly confusing because, I don't know, Paul van der Klay is maybe looking at this problem. I don't want to pigeonhole him because he's been very broad on this point on purpose because he doesn't know everything that's going on here, and he's made a point of making that point. But I would say that there are not just personal issues at stake in terms of people's spiritual, religious views and morality. There are political flaws here. There are broken political systems that are structurally creating a certain kind of ethos. And I think a lot of that is to do with the poisoned American outlook, which is the idea that the sovereignty of the democracy is relied on too much. I think, we have to reconceive of what it means for people to be sovereign. I think for people to be sovereign, their dignity must be respected as individuals, and they need a higher grade of liberal rights that is judicially actionable against the collective, against the state. The idea that the majority, that the democratic consensus can sort of step on the individual is something that undermines fundamental dignity. So I would say that, you've created this experiment, this American experiment, where the law is itself, the American citizen is a lab rat in an experiment. And this is only justified by essentially saying that justice is subordinated to the sovereignty of the people. Now, it's hard to have a higher view of democracy than the American psyche does, and I think it's actually untenable. It's retarded. And I think that basic retardation and that oversight is creating a shadow through which you get all the kind of corruption that you get in America. When your courts don't actually help you sort things out, because the law itself is politically manufactured. There isn't enough constitutional supremacy and constitutional Bill of Rights. I don't actually believe you need to necessarily have movement on these big structural questions and big political questions that I've outlined. But I do just think awareness of them is useful in order to sort of place yourself in the right moral framework. To sort of position yourself. I mean, perhaps I say this as an outsider, as a foreigner to America, so I don't know what it would be like to sort of disaffect yourself from the political context there. But somehow I just feel that it's a necessary step to sort of occlude yourself from the tides of the world and the movements of the seas and whatever shifting of the world that goes on around you, which I think was the point of developing secular liberalism, is so that one can essentially have the political domain on lockdown, have it sort of, it's not as if it doesn't perform a special or important function, it does, but that not as important as the cultural, liberal expression of one's religion and proselytizing one's religion on an individual basis or on a group basis that's organized in civil society by private individuals. So, yeah, I do think that there is this kind of, I don't even know what I could call it, hubris, I think, hubristic American sense of what a sovereign people can achieve. And that hubris has already created its antithesis in terms of the culture war. But yeah, I think that it's not a moral question, it's a political question as to whether that can be resolved. Individual morality, I don't think, is the proper response to it. As I've also tried to exemplify through going through the McCarthyist era and stuff like that. Anyway, yeah, I guess that's a good summary of maybe all my ideas on this issue.